able to see through her privatisation programme. We see the privatisation of BT, British Airways, Jaguar, Rolls-Royce, various water and electronic companies, and she's significantly able to curb the power of the trade unions. Now, the trade unions caused a lot of problems, as you know, during the winter of discontent, and also then throughout the 80s. Secondly, Blair was able to get through his constitutional reforms program since 1997. Now, it was felt that Britain lagged behind many sort of European and Western democracies, and they needed to modernise the UK constitution as a result, obviously, of it being uncodified and unentrenched. So we can talk about things like devolution here. We can talk about the reform of the judiciary since 2005 under the Constitutional Reforms Act. Okay, and we can also talk about the strengthening of the protection of human rights through the Human Rights Act of 1998 and the ECHR, the European Convention of Human Rights, which was incorporated into the Human Rights Act in the year 2000. So there's a lot that you can mention in regards to Blair's constitutional reforms program. And for these two examples, what primarily enabled these two prime ministers, Thatcher and Blair, to see through their policy aims and objectives was this large majority, okay, this large governing majority that they had whilst they were in office. It enabled them to implement legislation a lot easier and see legislation passed a lot easier through Parliament, through the House of Commons and through the House of Lords. Now, a more recent contemporary example is Boris Johnson and his Brexit withdrawal agreement. Obviously, he had a majority government, or he has a majority government at the moment, after the 2019 general election in December. And as a result of that, we see Boris Johnson with an 80-seat majority, and immediately in January, he was able to pass through his Brexit withdrawal agreement without facing any problems, okay? The problems that faced Theresa May, and the problems that he actually faced between September and October of 2019. Now, the argument there is that they're able to dominate, okay, in relation to the question. Now, your counter-argument will then be, well, what circumstances limit the power of the Prime Minister to dominate the UK political system? So, for example, we can talk about minority governments here, and we can talk about coalition governments. Obviously, coalition governments, we can talk about Cameron, perhaps from 2010 to 2015, although I don't really focus on him here, and minority governments, okay? So minority governments limit the ability of the Prime Minister to dominate. So, for example, Theresa May failed to get her Brexit withdrawal agreement passed, and she suffered the biggest government defeat in the Commons in history, okay? She was defeated by 230 MPs. Now, this is the biggest defeat in history, okay, in the House of Commons, and she suffered the largest backbench rebellion in history as well. So that means the amount of MPs in her own Conservative Party who rebelled and voted against her withdrawal agreement. That shows how unpopular the agreement was, but obviously how unpopular May was as a Prime Minister as well, who failed to get a grip of circumstances such as negotiating a withdrawal from the European Union. Another contemporary example, September to October 2019, when Boris Johnson had a minority government, he suffered a total of 12 defeats in these 2 months in the House of Commons on things like calling an early general election under the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. He failed to do that on about 2 to 3 occasions, and he also failed to pass through his own version of his Brexit withdrawal agreement on numerous occasions. And then all we need to do, slap on the end of that, is a mini judgment. Well, in our mini judgment, of course, we need to evaluate both these arguments, but we also need to return to our consistent line of argument which we should have running throughout our essay. So our mini judgment then needs to weigh up these two arguments. Well, what impacts the ability of the Prime Minister to dominate the UK political system, okay? And this brings us back to the varying set of circumstances, okay? It's a varying set of political circumstances that Prime Ministers find themselves in that sort of dictate their ability to dominate the UK political system, okay? So we need to reinforce that argument that the ability of a Prime Minister to dominate the UK political system, it fluctuates, it ebbs and flows according to different circumstances. The circumstances we're talking about here are political circumstances, which is specifically majority minority governments. Okay. Right. Next. Okay. So for our next paragraph, our second paragraph, we can refer to the Prime Minister's ability to dominate the UK political system and how that can be affected by events beyond his or her control. Now, in this signpost sentence, I've directly quoted from the source. So it says here in the third paragraph, but possibly the most serious limitation on prime ministerial power lies with events beyond his or her control. Okay? So that part can be put into quotation marks. As I said, what you need to do is you need to look at the source, okay, alongside writing your essay, and you need to embed quotations from the source at every opportunity possible, okay, when making your own analysis and including your own examples throughout your paragraphs, okay. That will demonstrate to the examiner that you have used the source, okay, consistently throughout your essay, and it will lead to high AO1 marks. So here, second paragraph, Prime Minister's ability to dominate the UK political system can be affected by events beyond his or her control. And what we mean by that is events that occur unexpectedly that the Prime Minister suddenly has to respond to. And it's that response to those events which they're ultimately judged on, okay? So in terms of examples of Prime Ministers able to dominate events, we've got Thatcher and the Falklands War in 1982, where her public opinion approval rating previously was 36%. Now, 36% approval rating for Thatcher, that was the lowest of any Prime Minister in the post-war era, so after the Second World War onwards. It was the lowest approval rating of any Prime Minister, 36%, after opinion poll data was beginning to be gathered. And then the Falklands really transforms Thatcher's position, okay? It transforms her command over a party, and it paints her as this sort of figure, as this sort of Prime Minister that is able to reach a position of absolute command and then is able to communicate that command with the public across a number of different policy areas. So she actually sustained a 47% approval rating to the 1983 general election, where we see her majority, her governing majority, increased. Interestingly, immediately after the Falklands, her satisfaction rating temporarily jumps to 59%. And then we've got Blair and the death of Princess Diana. Now, this is really, really key, because after the death of Princess Diana, the Queen, as you know, takes a few days to respond to her death and actually communicate a message to the public. Whereas Blair, through the People's Princess speech, he able to do so effectively, okay? So he's able to capture the mood of the nation, and he's able to strike a chord with public sentiment, okay? Such that his approval rating after that speech jumps to 74%, okay? And that is almost 3/4 of the population then, as an average. On the other hand, in terms of counter-argument, Prime Ministers not being able to dominate events, okay, so we've got Brown in the financial crash in 2008. Now, despite the fact that Brown dealt with the financial crash pretty well, the media painted him out as a Prime Minister who was incapable of dealing with it, okay? And one of the main things that we can add here is a little link, okay? So we can add a little link to the source in terms of media image. So it says Tony Blair, for example, began with a positive media image and public image, but was widely mistrusted